In 20 years, Australia's spent time trying to build up a toolbox of approaches. I don't know about internet connection. I might be unstable at this point. So there's risk assessments, there's spatial management, there's management strategy evaluation, which obviously the guys here that do stock assessment are well and truly aware of. And then there's been a whole bunch of legal side, so supporting the harvest and bycatch strategy implementation and how to update that for multiple species and climate. And then a whole range of new tools that are coming online. It's been in response to an increasing list of pressures in the Australian EEZ, and it has actually seen some species and ecosystem recoveries. So if we just look over the course of my own career, it went from looking at just food webs and fisheries to looking at the management loop and having that whole management strategy evaluation represented for sustainable fisheries, and then actually going broader into socio-ecological systems. So across every industry that works in the marine space, up into the coastal rangelands, into climate, and trying to get ahead of making the mistakes in the ocean that we have on land. So if we think about the explosion that's happened on land since the Industrial Revolution and the great acceleration of the 1950s, that's happening in the oceans right now. So can we do a better job at getting ahead of sustainably managing that than we managed on land? So the toolbox is made up of 3 different kinds of modelling types. There's the conceptual modelling that you do for understanding, so you can use qualitative models to do that, so stick and ball kind of diagrams. You can do quantitative algebra on the back of to do press perturbations. There's tactical year-to-year modelling, such as stock assessment modelling. And then there's strategic modelling, the kind that I do the most, where you look at the whole big system and what it's doing into the future. We've intentionally taken a co-production from the outset. So in Australia, our management councils have NGOs, public members, recreational fishermen, industrial fishermen, the managers, the scientists, the policymakers, all on they're having a discussion together so they can understand why change is needed. So working with people has been a key part of this. It's also built around a separation, an intentional separation of the management decision-making from the policy, from the research. So it's not like at NOAA where the research sits in amongst the management. We're actually separate. We're seen as the honest brokers who will give advice to whoever asks. So that could be industry, it could be management, it could be NGOs, it could be Indigenous elders, it's whoever asks. Diet samples for the area I work in was 25 years ago. So there's a lot of models that are now saying, no, back the other way, we need more data. So we've helped do that through having some management reform. And so this started about 15 years ago now. In 2005, they realised that economically, socially and ecologically, the big southeast fishery, so if you imagine the southern half of Australia, it's about 3.7 million square kilometres. They were headed for collapse, basically. There was quite a lot of overfished stocks. They weren't making any money. And so they all decided they needed to do something. So it was a 2-part process. They did narrative, qualitative ideas about what that future might look like. And then they had me doing a quantitative model in parallel. At the other end of that, the version of the scenarios that we had sort of put in there for reference, we didn't think it would ever come to actuality. It was just if scientists ran the world, what would it look like? It actually has ended up being the way that they do management in Australia. Let the fishermen see that there are options out there that they didn't know about. So they went off to the politicians and said, can we do something about it? And the politicians actually put some money up. And if I can ask Chen to maybe turn his video off so that we can see the screen, that'd be really helpful. So they went off to the politicians to see what they could do, and then they ended up restructuring all of Australia's fisheries. Let's see if I can actually just move that out of the way. So it was a really successful political response. It's actually, so it happened, remember to do it over here. It happened about here, and you can see overnight we drastically reduced the amount of overfishing happening. And once we've got to here, the latest few years, there's now no domestic overfishing happening in Australia. So there's still some shared stocks that we don't have complete control over where there's some overfishing. And there's some stocks that are still recovering from past overfishing, but in the main, you can see that the majority of stocks are on the increasing side of their status. So it's been a fairly successful effort. But it comes with the caveat that Australia doesn't catch a lot of fish in the first place because it's a really poor old continent. It's the oldest planetary, the continental crust on the planet. So it used to be as high as Everest, like 3 billion years ago. It's now very flat. Our tallest mountain is like a hill. And so there's no nutrients left in it. It's really dead. So that's reflected in the production in the ocean. It's really low. So I think in total we get like 300,000 tonnes in total of everything that you've added up. And but it's worth orders of magnitude more than places like Chile that get 10 times the amount of catch. We intentionally, in making that shift, moved to high value products. In fact, I was in a project with Trevor and we were plotting up the different catches, and he was like, where's Australia's catch gone? The data's wrong. I was like, no, Trev, that's actually what we really catch. So that's been a part of why we could do this, because there was like 600 commercial fishermen in Australia, so we could buy some out to make those kind of changes. It's not necessarily something that's going to work everywhere, but it has worked for us. Yep. A part of that has been to have formal harvest strategies, which I'll detail in a second, but we are struggling now with some of those as we've come to review them, that there are some species that aren't recovering. And part of that is because it's the Australian fisheries are multi-species fisheries, a bit like a tropical fishery. So that big southeast fishery catches 400 species, often in big mixed trawls. So what's happening is that there's some species that are choking the others, so that if you have a TAC on one of them, it's constraining the catch of other ones. But it's also, there's so few fishermen left that they just physically can't get out there to catch all the different species potentially. And then there's trophic and ecological interactions and climate change and a whole bunch of other things. But we basically have to think about how we really do multi-species fisheries. So we're trying to revise the harvest control rules. Also, there's been a big push to coordinate instructions across the different departments. So it used to be that the Department of Environment and the fisheries guys had different rules about when a species was in trouble or not. So, which wasn't so much of an issue for fish, but it was an issue for the large marine mammals and stuff. So they've coordinated those, so they're giving a consistent message now. And then we're starting to learn how to adapt to climate change. One of the first lessons we're trying to deal with is if this is a bit of a cartoon of what an ecosystem looks like. So these squares are biomass pools for invertebrate groups and primary producers. And these funny shapes are to a bit of a comic of age structure. So you've got lots of juveniles and not as many adults. So in 1910, when commercial fishing began in Australia, this is a bit of a cartoon of what that ecosystem looked like. By 2000, we had radically changed the shape of that ecosystem. So the mesopelagic fish had come up in a large amount of biomass. We'd lost large-bodied species like southern bluefin tuna, not only in biomass, but we'd truncated their age structure. So we'd really restructured the ecosystem. Now, what's happened in the fisheries is that the B0 year of any one single species was just the year before we started to commercially take them. So the B0s aren't consistent. You can't make an ecosystem with the B0s that we currently use. They're from all different parts of when the ecosystem was bouncing around. So one of the first steps is to try and coordinate to say, actually, what ecosystem structure are we after, so that we can send the management in a direction that actually makes sense. And that's difficult because even in model world, you get different community structures in different locations. So this is the extent of the big southeast fishery that we have. In fact, it goes a little bit further west. So there's lots of different ecosystems that sit within that one management amalgam. But they're all trying to be managed through this harvest strategy policy, which is a fairly common broken stick shape. We have maximum economic yield as our target, so B48. And then B20 is when we have to stop fishing on a species, or at least try to stop fishing. We also have tiers, much like they do in some of the US ones, where depending on how good your data is, you have less buffering of your allowable catch. The more uncertain the data is, the more reduction you have to take in catch. So they've started, well, they got me to MSE test that across at an ecosystem scale. So if we employed that for the target species, what did it mean for the whole rest of the system with regard to being able to deliver on the broader ecosystem objectives? So what we did was we applied those. We also looked at a bunch of other management options like spatial management, geared control. We even looked at if you had different management on different sides of jurisdictional boundaries. So in Australia, that might be different states, but in places like the US or Canada or Mexico, it could be a different country. So you hear lots of people in Australia and elsewhere say, well, don't bother putting your management too harsh if it's a shared stock, because the other guy will just benefit and you'll lose out. So we actually went ahead to try that. And basically what we found was that no management performs the worst, not just for target species, but for the whole ecosystem and the economics. And then poor or ineffective management, where there's no enforcement or no compliance, regardless of whether it's single species or ecosystem-based management, that's pretty shit. So it basically goes no management, then bad single species management, bad ecosystem management, good single species management. So good single species management outdoes badly done ecosystem-based management. But good multi-species management and ecosystem-based management actually outdo single species-based management, both for the target species, but for the whole supporting ecosystem and the economics, if they're actually enforced and done properly. So that paper came out late last year, and it's already starting to get traction in Australia, and the management authorities leapt on board towards restructuring for climate effects, but also to really push this multi-species harvest control rule thinking. And we also found that the jurisdictional thing, it's always in your favour to do the best thing you can on your side of the border, regardless of what they're doing on the other side. Even if the other side's not doing any management, you're still better off doing what the best you can on your side of the border. So it has led to, Australia's already had a pretty good investment in science-based fisheries management, but it's pushed further into that. And the first step has been to look at multi-species harvest control rules, and we're just at the point of spitballing what they might look like. So if you've got one target species and you're aiming for its F48, then the species caught with it just need to fall in the pretty good yield range is one idea. So you're just trying to get them both about where they need to be without being too prescriptive. And if you can't find a pretty good yield range for one of the species and you're sort of off down here, you're going to have to change selectivity. And so that's where I grew up on a farm with a big old massive Ferguson tractor, and you had all these handles to drive the thing around. And that, for me, that's the way of thinking about it. Each métier, each fleet target species composition is one of those handles. So by setting the effort on the different métiers, you're steering the pressure on the ecosystem to get the ecosystem structure that you're after. And that kind of description is actually resonating in a lot of different places. It's easiest where you have a fairly clean catch with one species, but it's actually, we're working in Thailand and Myanmar and India and stuff, and it's working there as well with regard to being able to reshape how they're doing some of their fishery stuff. One of the other ideas was to adjust for the choke species so that you bring down, so in Australia it's called the weak companion species, so we have species that you just can't separate in the catch, they always get caught together. So the question is, if you've got two really different TACs for those species, what do you do? Do you bring down the strong one so that this weak one is never under pressure? Or do you sacrifice the weak one so that you can maximise catch of the strong one? So at the present moment, under Australian law, you have to bring down the strong one and don't stress the weak one, but that's a social choice. So it is possible in other locations that they will intentionally sacrifice a weaker one. And that's the kind of social question that we're having in countries like Thailand, where it's food supply that they're worried about and less about conservation. One of the other ideas, and the Scots have done a fair bit on this, is around trying to make the way that you fish the system in line with the structure of the system. So the sort of the classic, with all the best of intentions, the advice for the last 30 years has been go in, get the species that you want with a minimal effect on everything else. But that's ignoring the topology of food webs. And so if you go in with a surgical strike and you take out some species, it doesn't make much difference. So if you take out what's called a hub species, the whole place shatters. So one of the ideas that was come up, led by Serge Garcia, was a thing called balanced harvest. Now, I don't think it's necessarily practical to get to balanced harvest, but some of the ideas are actually worth thinking about with regard to topological structure. What would be the kinds of mix of Fs that you would get if you were trying to match the biomass and topology of an unfished system, and then you look at where your Fs are actually sitting at the present moment. And so you bring down the Fs. So the idea was to actually allow us to do assessments for climate risk, for ecological exposure to fishing risk, and increasingly cumulative risk. So the original work was led by Alistair Hobday and Ilona Strabutsky, and they basically created a hierarchical method of being able to say whether a species was at low exposure and low vulnerability, or whether it was highly exposed. And you could do that at a species level, a habitat level, or a community level. And together they managed to filter 1,200 odd species, which I'll get to in a second. But the basic idea is that expanding that concept, you go and you have a look at what you're trying to scope. So the area, then is it just a single pressure you're worried about, or is it cumulative pressure with all the different things like climate and fishing and renewable energy and tourism and everything? Then you go through these various steps. So you have a qualitative step where you get experts to rank the likelihood of that kind of exposure and the outcome that it would potentially have for the group, and you can change that into qualitative models to do more explicit press perturbation analysis. And then you start to get into the more quantitative or the semi-quantitative, where you start to look at what are those, the susceptibility versus vulnerability. And at each step, you only take those rated at moderate to high risk up the chain, so that you're zooming in on those that are most likely to be at risk. And no data means you're immediately classified as at high risk. It's a very precautionary approach. At the top end, you get into full quantitative assessment, whether that's a single species assessment, a statistical empirical analysis, or something like Atlantis to play through an MSE. Even at these earlier stages, you can see how the exposure might change with different management options. So the idea is that you go to literature or to experts and you collect this qualitative information about which pathways to think about. Then you go and get the experts to classify what they think the likelihood of occurrence is, and then the consequence of the occurrence. So, for example, in this example, pretty much all of them think that this event's not going to happen, but one person thought it was going to happen with a high likelihood. Whereas this one, it was much more mixed about whether people thought it was actually even going to happen. Whereas then you look at the consequence, and in this case here, most people thought even if it did happen, it wouldn't make much of a difference, whereas one person thought it would have a high effect. So that you can start to build up these plots of what people thought was likely to happen and how bad it was going to be. Such as the fisheries management. Once you put it on those kind of scales, then you can look at how that picture changes from low risk to high risk across different management options. So without even having to get super quantitative, you can actually step through this risk process. So if we just look at the ecological risk alone, this was the stuff that Alistair and co led. They looked at what the areas that they wanted to think about were, then they did the sort of the expert ranking. And so they went from 600 species at that stage down to 159 that they took into this kind of mapping. And from there, they were left with 25 that they had to take to the whole quantitative assessment. So that's how they managed to, in a 3-year period, basically classify the risk to every single species that the fisheries in Australia interacts with. And now that gets reviewed on a 5-year cycle just to make sure that that broader risk isn't accidentally spreading. And they even look at things like residual risk. That basic process has now been broadened out into other things such as climate. So we actively look at the climate vulnerability in Australia. We've had some pretty fast warming in different parts of Australia, particularly down around Tasmania where I live. So the way that they look at the climate vulnerability is to look at the biological aspects of the species, but also all of the human aspects of the fishery. So you can see the majority of this is on the human side. On a 5-year basis, we now review this kind of the biological part, so that we're looking for acclimation, adaptation, evolution, degree of exposure, because climate hasn't done what we thought it would. The human side is much less responsive, actually, so we don't have to check on that quite as often. The reason that this is a big question is Australia is already feeling, at the fisherman management level, is already feeling the effects of climate change. So on a day-to-day basis now, they have to make decisions about whether a fish stock is declining because of climate, whether it's just moved to somewhere else, whether its productivity is shifted. What do they do if it's a new species coming into the area, like in Tasmania? Do we start a fishery? Do we hold off? Do you allow fishermen from elsewhere to come into your jurisdiction, or do you say to bugger off, they're mine now, and start your own fishery? Those kind of conversations are happening a lot. Recreational fishermen in Australia are super happy, in Tasmania are super happy about all these semi-tropical species that are now arriving. We're having multiple heat waves, which is really knocking things like abalone around. So in 2015-16, we had 256 days where the water temperature was 3 to 4 degrees higher than it normally is. So there were quite a lot of tropical species that were suddenly off Tasmania, and you're like, oh, I think you're a bit lost, guys. But what we've also done is a lady called Greta Peckel has set up what's called RedMap, and it's basically citizen science. So people with their phones take a picture of a fish in a location they've never seen before and upload it to the net, and that's helping us track species distributional shifts. So I think we're up to 85 new species in Tasmania in the last 5 years now. It's really changing the way the ecosystems work. But on top of that, there's been quite a lot of extreme events. So over the last 10 years, we've lost 40% of Australia's marine habitats to extreme events, so bleaching events, heat waves, die-offs, all those kind of things. So if that was on land, there'd be a pretty major public backlash. But because it's happening under the ocean, people aren't realising that that's there. It's also seeing pretty large changes in productivity, particularly in the southeast. So some upwellings have strengthened, some have decreased. The blooms have changed in southeast Australia. And so now there's a mismatch between when the recruits are in the water and when there's plankton to feed them, basically. So that's changing the productivity of a whole bunch of species, and at least one species has been formally declared as climate affected, and its potential recovery metric has actually been changed. It can't get back to the biomasses that it was at originally. So what we've had to do as a part of trying to advise and help fisheries science about that is to have a modelling toolbox of different approaches. So we've intentionally gone as broad as we can to include as many different types of models as possible. So we have some that are just based on statistical distribution. So fish get more diverse as they go deeper in Australia. So you have those metrics and you sort of say, okay, this is a proxy for where the abundance might be. We've got intentional species distribution models where you look at where they are today and then you forecast those conditions into the future and see where they might have gone. Julia Blanchard is leading up the size and trait-based modelling down there and has really brought that along a fair way. There's the classic trophic models of EcoPath with EcoSim and EcoSpace, which has now got quite a lot of physical drivers and sub-grid scale habitat representation in it as well. There's agent-based and hybrid models that I specialise in with age structure and habitat use and individual-based models as well. But there's also Bayesian networks looking at transitional probabilities, and a guy called Jeff Dambacker has done something now where you can have your alternative Bayesian networks as your different hypotheses about what the world is doing now or what it might do into the future. And then you can sort of run them backwards to say, okay, given the data, which is actually the most likely one to be true? So that you can then do that into the future as well and say, okay, which pathway are we on? Because that can change the kind of science that you need or the management that you need to respond. And then there's the models of intermediate complexity that Eva Plegani leads, and that's to do with taking kind of that stock assessment view of the world that's very closely fit to data, but expanding it to include climate drivers or economic drivers. So that means that we can now cover continental Australia. So in, 18 months ago, the Australian Fisheries Management Authority came to us with about 6 weeks' notice and said, we'd really like to know what's going to happen to all of the fish stocks of Australia over the next 5 to 20 years. There was a moment of heart-blending panic. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I just rang around everyone and said, can we all just get our models together and see what it says? So we patchworked a map around Australia. We did find our hole, but we've now got that pretty much covered. Luckily, we're also in FishMIP, which is the model into comparison to inform the IPCC of the future of the oceans. So William Chung and Julia Blanchard kindly extracted their Australia-wide parts of their global models so that we could compare as well. So we had a true ensemble approach to look at all of those projections. So we had per species maps for 1,100 species from William. We had total biomass and biomass per size from Julia. And then in each region, we had trajectories from the other models on catch and biomass for either individual species or whole ecosystems. And something that was an interesting first result that we found was that if you just looked at the global models, say the species distribution models, we've seen a lot of papers out there recently saying, oh, it's all going to decline, there's a huge loss in biodiversity, a loss in catch. And that was being predicted for Australia as well. So less than a 20% drop in many cases in many different regions around Australia, but at least some drop through to quite extreme drops. But once you brought in the trophics, it was a very different picture. So the trophic responses, even with temperature effects on all parts of the ecosystem, didn't agree that it's a universally bad picture. So it's going to be a lot messier than maybe some of the initial papers suggested. What we did find was that 60 to 70% of the target species in Australia were susceptible to climate impacts. Whether that was going to be a major change up or down, we weren't quite sure. In some cases, the model said, oh, it might not change or it might go down. So half the simulation said no change, half the simulation said a drop. Here it was a bit messier with sort of the largest group saying it would go up. Here for the small pelagics, it said mostly won't change. Here it said mostly won't change more because it's already changed. But there was a 12% that actually said catastrophically will collapse and you will lose the fishery altogether. For Australia's largest fishery, that was enough, even though it was a small percentage of simulations, for the fisheries managers to say, no, we need to be better prepared. So something I have seen in the last 20 years, instead of just playing the most likely outcome, so if you'd gone back 20 years ago, they would have said, it's on the tail, we don't care about the tail. Now they're obsessed about the tail. They want to be better prepared for those extreme outcomes. So what that meant, and Alistair Hobday was the guy who originally came up with this picture, is that it's changed the way that we do science and management. So in the past, it used to be that you had observation, attribution, and then a response. And it could be that there was a whole scientific career in each one of these steps, or one science career would span getting enough information. But the system is changing so quickly, particularly in Australia, that there's no point going through those steps on a career basis, because by the time you get to here, it's changed anyway. So we now need to do this. We need to be a little bit more daring and putting things out there before we're 100% sure, but doing it in such a way that there's no regrets, so that you're intentionally adaptive. You're intentionally responding to what you have. You're clear that what the uncertainties are. And the fisheries managers are learning how to deal with that uncertainty, right down to individual fishermen now asking about uncertainty and why are they taking that line instead of a more precautionary line and that kind of stuff. Mainly because they've been burnt. They're learning by experience. So the management response to this has actually been to ask us to help them make their management climate robust. So this is a process that's currently underway. As with most things in Australia, it's been done on the sniff of an oily rags and a lot of money. So we're doing it mainly empirically and based on experts. So the idea is that you come up and you say, what's the climate driver doing? What's the ecological outcome of that, like a shift in the species or it's less productivity? What does that mean for what the fishery actually sees? So maybe a catch level or a shift in where they go. So then how do they respond? So you're actually talking to the fishermen. If this was a situation, what would you do? Some of them will switch species. Some of them will go look somewhere else. Then we go to the market and say, well, how do you respond? And in some cases, the market's like, well, we could never be able to sell that species. It's just not going to happen. Or in other ones, it's like, well, that's not a constant enough supply. We'll just give up and buy stuff from Vietnam, which happens a lot in Australia. So we have to look at the market implications, the price implications, and then the management. Did they modify the TAC to account for a shift in productivity? Did they need to bring in additional rules like new zoning measures or shift where spatial management sits? Or if it goes off to a new species, do they need to put in new gear controls or think about allowing fishermen to shift gears or shift fisheries without having to exchange licenses? What's the implications of all of that for the other species, the new species being caught, the new bycatch species, the threatened, endangered, protected species? So you're trying to think almost like an onion. What's the immediate effect? What's the first round of knock-on effects? What's the second round? And And it is being helped by qualitative perturbation modelling, but it's the unintended consequences were the hardest part. People were quite comfortable getting to about here, and then the knock-on part was the more challenging thing for them to think about. They wanted to do their immediate response, and they're like, does that make sense just to do this immediate response, or is it going to come back and bite you in the ass? So one of the things that we've done to help them try to do that is another process called Ocean Futures, where we're trying to think of different ways that the future might be. So that might be an explosion of the blue economy with lots of offshore platforms where they do aquaculture in 200 metres of water with renewable energy sources and offshore ports. Another one was where, for carbon reasons, they ban all flights and you have to do everything by ship. Another one was the gig economy comes to science and everybody only gets like a day-to-day allocation of what you're doing today. So some of these sound ridiculous, but most of you have a mobile phone in your pocket, right? Back when I started my PhD, that was as powerful as the most powerful computer owned by NASA or the US administration. I had to actually figure out how big an array I could fit on a 386 chip, which explains quite a lot of the tormented mentality of Atlantis. So we've come a long way in the intervening time. So trying to think about what was possible before and after the invention of the smartphone, it really has changed the way that we think about the way we interact. They use them, pretty cheap smartphones, but still smartphones in Borneo and India to actually create GPS networks of, I found the fish over here, come over here. So it's helping them find fish or to respond to fish. In India, they're using it to map the effort locations. So in India, they actually collect a huge amount of data on the catch composition and the landings. But with 9 million fishermen, they also have this beautiful map of what's happening around the coast once they bring all their data, their phone data together. So it's about trying to explore what those different futures will be like, both if you do adapt and you bring science with it, or you don't adapt and you just sort of see how it plays out. It helps people think outside the box. And that brings us into the cumulative impacts of everything being layered on at the same time. So there's lots of different ways that you can have cumulative impacts, whether it's the one thing having multiple effects on other things, which is what they mean in engineering when you say cumulative impact, or whether it's just a transition through time. So you have one event and then another event, which in chemistry, or actually a lot of medicine, they think of as a cumulative impact, where having one disease predisposes you to another one. And then there's additive events, where you have a sequence of events happening through time. Or what's happening in the marine world is where you're having multiple different things happening and then they interact with each other as well. And that's important because it dictates what kind of effect that you're having, whether you're having no effect whatsoever, whether the most dominant thing is actually dictating overall effect, whether you're having additive effects, which is the underlying assumption of pretty much every ecological statistical explanation like an ANOVA, or whether there's interaction effects. So whether you're getting things that are compounding and making it a synergistic outcome, or whether they're buffering each other. And knowing which one it is important for the management response. Because if you put money into reducing something that's actually being antagonistic, you may get a counter response. So you've reduced something, but the situation gets worse because you've actually taken out the buffering component. On the flip side, if you can find the synergistic ones and nail those, you get a bigger bang for your buck. So it's trying to find those synergistic ones in particular. It's also trying to find how to do it in a non-linear way. So most of the time when it's done at the present moment, and this is actually a great example for when it was done, it was a really big effort. They brought a lot of data together, but they just additively added up the layers. And so there was no interaction, number one. And then how do you get across uncertainty, number two? So that's the next step. So even the people who are involved in this are keen to bring it across. But particularly, how do you, in an interacting one, how do you actually get these end maps? Because the managers and the stakeholders actually respond really well to maps. It's just finding the right content to put into them. Another part has been looking beyond just the fisheries end. So Eva Plagani led some work where she looked at the entire supply chain through the seafood sector. And so there's lots of different components to what that is. It's not just about the fish and getting it to the shop. There's all the steps in between around processes and sales, information used. And if we look at where the nudge points are, the existing options that you have about changing how fisheries act and making them more robust to climate, there's almost none left at the fisherman end of things. So this is the fish and the fisherman. All the rest of it is a supply chain. So you can see that most of the actual abilities in other parts of the supply chain. We've pretty much done everything we can with fish and fishermen. We have to explore the rest of the supply chain now. And this was one of the reasons that Australia started to move towards a economic yield instead of sustainable yield as its target reference points, because it's more conservative biologically, but it's also pushing the pressure back to where we actually had some nudge points. Now, at the other end, there has been some technological breakthroughs we're using in Australia, so the pendulum is swinging back to the observational end. The first of those has been led by Chris Wilcox, looking at artificial intelligence and tracking illegal fishing, particularly to the north of Australia it started off, but he's now going much broader. So there's two ways that he does this mainly. So one is to look at the navigational pingers that they have on boats. So humans are very good at conning themselves. So if a pirate's about to do something illegal, like transship, he actually thinks about doing that before he remembers to turn his pinger off. So his behaviour changes first. And the AI goes, yeah, he's over there. He's about to do something naughty. He hasn't done it yet, but he's about to. And it can warn the Coast Guard, who can go off and get him. So he's extending that across the world. The other part is that the radar that they now have on satellite can resolve down to a 6-metre boat, even if it's wooden, so that you can track where some of those small vessels are going. And you can also use hydrophones to hear them, even down to the splash of paddles in the water, and AI can now pick up some of those aspects. So using AI to help filter the amount of data that you've got to track where illegal fishing is happening, either to stop it altogether or actually to account for it in your assessment processes. The other way that they're using AI is to basically replace, so in Australia we have observers on between 2 and 10% of the boats, but all of the boats need to have electronic reporting and now electronic on-deck cameras. So any fisherman in Australia would have known that there was way more video being collected than any human could actually scrub through without going mentally insane. So they were really only scrubbing through a tiny, tiny percent, and the rest of it was just being put in big boxes in the data repository and never looked at. So they've been training AIs to run over it, to do species identification so that they can, in the first instance, what paid for it was people love cuddly furry things, so they were looking for seals and marine mammals. But they're now trained it to look at fish of different kinds, and they're even trying to, well, they're in the process of getting it to do size, for instance, so that they can start to really expand the amount of available data that they have and to blow that up. The other one that came along was led by Mark Bravington. It has also been a huge revolution in the way that they do biomass estimates in Australia. So it's called close kin mark recapture. So instead of going to, Australia doesn't do this thing called surveys. This fisheries independent data, that's like way overrated, right? We need money for hospitals. So we just use catch dependent data. So you can imagine how unreliable some of our estimates were. So what they did was, instead of going to sea, they went to the market and they just got DNA samples from the fish in the market. And then using some maths, they said, we're looking for parents and offspring. So they were using the DNA as the tag. And so they could say, okay, given on this number of relationships, it must mean that the estimate of biomass is about this. And so they've done it for tunas, they've done it for sharks, they've done it for actually a whole list of species in Australia now. And they're validated against some other estimates and some surveys of particularly small stocks. But it looks to come up with a really robust biomass estimate, a lot more precise than we would have got any other ways. And it's starting to replace other means of surveying animals for a lot lower price, particularly with the speed up in or the reduction in cost in how much it is to do a DNA sample. The other place we're using DNA is to look at diets. So the first 2 bars here are diets from the 1990s, and the last 2 bars here are diets from the 2000s. So the sample sizes are embarrassingly small, but that's all you can fit on the back of a fishing vessel when they're all worried about catching fish and you're just trying to stay out of the way. But we can say that there has been a change in diet. We don't know what. So if you just cut open their stomachs, it's just mush. It's like, I don't know what it was. It was a fish once. I don't know what fish it was. So we know they'd gone from eating not too much fish in this species to eating a fair number of fish. But then along came the eDNA. So we were able to go through. The first round wasn't particularly helpful because we didn't have enough Australian barcodes. So we knew it could have eaten all these Arctic fish, which we kind of doubted, a turtle, a Galapagos turtle, and a chimpanzee, which we think might have been the lab tech who contaminated the data set. But the second time round, we actually had more barcodes. So for the last 4 or 5 years, they've put effort into getting barcodes for actual Australian animals. And what they've realised is that the diversity of what these animals eat is way bigger than we ever appreciated from stomach samples. So including some predators that were actually scavenging things like dead turtles and dead whales and stuff. And we thought they were just pure piscivores. So it's really changed what we think about as the connectivity. It has raised, I have my son-in-law is a philosopher. It has raised some philosophical questions. If it's the prey of a prey, but you're still benefiting it from it nutritionally, does it still count as a prey interaction? All of those kind of questions have had to be mentally thought about as well, because they just crop up as another DNA entry with this method. The other thing, and this is probably, well, in the microbial world, it's working already. In the way that I'm about to explain it, it's probably a few years off. But they've also been working with quantum dots. So one method of detecting disease from fruit bats in Australia was to take the blood of a horse and do a dip test. And if it fluoresced, you knew the horse had the particular infection. So to me, that was like, oh, blood is seawater and flashing DNA. So I went and talked to the guys and they've managed to pull it off. They basically dope the quantum dots with different DNA snags of different species. Then it can be mounted on a CTD or a physical Argo float. So Beth was just jealous of all the Argo floats that are around the world. So mount a biological sensor on that, the animal swims past, a bit of DNA left from skin or feces connects with the quantum dot and it fluoresces. So you basically get back a spectrograph of the species that are in the local area. So at the present moment, they've got it working for microbes and micro eukaryotes, but the idea is, and they've started to do it, is to push it up through the rest of the eDNA barcode so that on a tiny chip, you can cover like 20,000, 30,000 species and get a fluorescence back of what species have been around. They've also got it to the point now where the number of fluoresces is proportional to the abundance of interaction, basically. So it can give you a proxy to relative abundance as well. So they've applied these kind of methods already on the microbial scale in transects up through from the Southern Ocean up to the equatorial ocean off New Zealand. And so what they found, at least in the microbial and micro eukaryotes, was that they found really strong productivity, biodiversity relationships. They found that they could pull out different community structure. And from a biogeochemical standpoint, which Atlantis uses, it could also identify what were the key processes happening, whether it was eutrophication related, nitrification, oxygen turnover, because the different bacterial strains could even fly up. And so that's now seeing it used in estuaries to flag when you've got a problem with water quality. So it's actually coming on quite a good way. Now, the reason we could go through all these kind of tools is we've been able to bring together lots of different disciplines. So this is my plug for work with someone who's in a discipline that you're really uncomfortable with, you know nothing about, because you'll have lots of disappointment, but when you make a breakthrough, boy, does it take you far. So we've worked with restaurateurs and policemen and oceanographers and chemists and managers and lawyers and bankers and whatever to look at what they need out of the fisheries, how they interact with it, what tools can we use, where are new data sources we hadn't thought about to really help push us along. What that's seen is historically when I started uni, we got taught everything about the North Sea or the North Pacific. I knew way more about that than I knew about anything in Australia. And then as you start to like, well, that doesn't work the same way and that doesn't work the same way. So we're starting to take these methods back the other way and help people in Europe and North America, but particularly we're growing a community of scientists across the Southern Hemisphere, understanding how Southern Hemisphere ecosystems work, which isn't always the same way as has been found in the Northern Hemisphere. And that actually brings me to the work that I'm doing here, where I'm collaborating with a whole bunch of countries around the world, with Alaska, the Bering Sea being one of the case studies, to look at how you get, what kind of ecosystem indicators can you piggyback on the back of single species management to get an ecosystem outcome. So for instance, for me, what topology indicators, so one of the ones I'm working with is the Google PageRank. If you apply that to food webs, it can identify what your critical species is. So you look at your food web, you apply, there's about 4 or 5 indicators you should probably use together, but the Google PageRank works pretty well. And it doesn't just identify the trophic levels, it identifies hub species. And what's that is important is because if you delete randomly, so an ecosystem is basically a topology that's been set up to be something that transmit production from top to bottom as fast as possible. So it takes in the primary production and it gets it to the rest of the system as quickly as possible. It's robust to random deletion of groups, so random species dropping out. It's really susceptible to the taking out of a hub species. So if you can identify those, you can help do conservation and sustainability, right? So one of the biggest arguments happening right now is between the pickage group about forage fish and the hillborn group about forage fish and whether you need to protect them or not. If you look at the topology of the two systems, the pickage group are working with ones where they're hub species and Ray's picked all the ones where they're not a hub species. So it's kind of, they're both right. Why are we having this argument? So it's about trying to help some of those conversations along as well. So you've heard a lot about the fisheries world. We're also working into the broader marine coasts of Australia. So Australia discovers data is basically what this slide says. So taking data and putting it up so that the managers can have live access to it to help make decisions, both at a tactical scale day to day, but also informing the longer term strategic plans. We've applied this in aquaculture too. So in Chile over the last 3 years, we've gone from taking in their existing data sets to helping them build risk models and data visualization packages to see that data. So for instance, taking the model data and the transect data to create maps of what's happening. So all of these little yellow dots are salmon farms in Chile. So if you want to know what the coast of Chile looks like, just look for the salmon farms because there's one about every 100 metres. And so you might want to know what's happening in the water column around the salmon farms if there's an outbreak or if it's too cold, so that they can now bring that information online, or they can look where there's an outbreak and look what might be affected downstream. And so we've helped with a bunch of, we did that same kind of risk analysis to find what the susceptibility, productivity and where the different farms sat compared to that. We've looked at their chance of dispersal. So if you get infected over here, it's going to keep it locally. If you get infected over here, it's going to spread it around everywhere else, which if you are one of these farms means that you don't have a long period of infection, but if you're downstream, you're in trouble. Whereas the guys over here are now benefiting from their own incentives of, yes, we get stuck with it, but at least we don't give it to anyone else, so we don't have to pay them compensation. So it's learning about those kind of things as well. We've also done a bunch of epidemiological prediction models. So the present moment, so this is uninfected. This is you've been low level of, you've been infected but treated, low level of active infection and a high level of active infection. So you can see from this bottom one, there's no Atlantic salmon getting to market from Chile that hasn't been sick at some point in its life. So that's helping them figure out how to change that so that they can reduce the antibiotics, because there's 5,000 tonnes of antibiotics used a year down there. How do they wind that back so that we don't get antibiotic resistant penguins, which we currently have, and dial it back to make it healthier. We've done the cost breakdown of different costs to try and figure out how to leverage them to give them incentives to have less risky behaviour. We've also created an agent-based model of the farms and other sectors in the area to look at interactions with, say, all of these brown dots are sea lions. So what they're finding is they've depleted their fish stocks to less than 20%. And so they just assume that the sea lions wanted to eat the salmon for sure. But even if you in the model make the seals not like sea lions, sea lions not like salmon, they can't find anything else to eat. So they just attack the salmon farms anyway. So they're now starting to realise that the fishermen and the salmon farms need to work together to fix this problem. Because their first response was, let's just kill the sea lions, but that then means they can't import to the US. So they've decided that probably isn't the best of ideas. So it's helping them think through some of those strategies as well. We've also taken the management strategy evaluation idea to that whole ecosystem approach, so across all the different users, to help them come up with report cards along the Great Barrier Reef coast, for instance, that takes into account not just ecology, but the water quality and the human uses of the system. And what that drove home to us was, how do you communicate this? So they were already using a report card there, we were just mimicking it. It's a bit hard to see, unfortunately, but we had to work with artists to say, what does the different scores mean? So this is an A, you've got a turtle, fish around it over a healthy seagrass bed. This is a C, you've got some seagrass, you've still got a few fish, you've got the turtle. By the time you get to a D, the turtle's gone, you've got half the fish and there's hardly any seagrass left. We've also done some mapping exercise. So there's a live website they can go to now and have a look at what the model output says. They suggest a scenario, we run it, we upload it so that there's that ongoing conversation with the local community about how they want to run their park. And it's also working with artists to try and give them what those different futures would look like. So it's still making it look cartoonish enough that they realise it's from a model. But so you've got, this is healthy conditions, there's seagrass beds, you have dugongs, you've got your large sharks, you've got fish populations. So it's kind of allows them to think about what that world could look like in an actual tangible way. Because the sad thing is, in the last 20 years, you haven't had to have maths or science to graduate from high school in Australia. So actual numerical literacy is now declining quite steeply. So to show someone a plot, they just don't actually understand what you're talking about. Whereas they can get this kind of picture pretty straightforwardly. On the upside, if anyone who's not an Australian would like to do a PhD in Australia, there's lots of people like me who now only take foreign students because we know that we don't have enough good Australian students with enough maths. On the flip side, we've also got the bad condition case. So the turtle disappears, you've got crappy algae all over the ground. You've got more large predators because they can hide and you can't see them coming. You've got slightly less fish, if you bother to sit down and count the fish, which the artist did. He also nicely, I don't know if you can see it, but around here somewhere, oh, there's the dead fish that he's added to the bottom of the picture. So you get giving them an actual real contrast between water quality and the number of things that interact with under the different conditions. And it's worked surprisingly well to communicate these different futures. So they'll talk about them once they can visualise in this way. So that's been a very fast and probably overblown discussion of what's happening in Australia, but just to give you a bit of context and a bit of a touch, I will be around. I've got a meeting pretty much all of next week, but I am around till the 28th of February if you wanted to follow up on any detail. I'm down in room 158, assuming that we don't get snowed closed again.
If you have any questions, please go ahead. And I'll just check to see that the folks over remotely can actually hear them. So go ahead. Trevor.
Hi, I should have said hi earlier. The quantum dots technology, so literally you can just put a chip out and have it detect any eDNA that floats past and
yeah, so Trevor was just asking how the quantum dot technology works. Yes, so that's the concept, and they've got it working for up to micro eukaryotes, so things like small zooplankton. You basically dope the quantum dots, which are nano dots, and they sit on a matrix, and it's like a magnetic lock and key. So they train the quantum dot on the DNA, like the first strand of the DNA, and the other part comes in and completes the lock, and that causes the fluorescence to happen. And so that's the process that's happening so far. So yeah, they've got the grids happening for things up to that micro eukaryote size.
Does the DNA have to be chopped up into the right size, or does it not matter?
No, it just tags onto the bit that's there. So you can have a bit that sort of flops over the end. It just recognises that right part, yeah. So it's making use of the natural desire to click with the right kinds of things in your RNA and stuff. So it started off as a disease detection method for veterinary samples and stuff like that. And it was just literally saying, okay, can we take this to a different direction? Yep.
So what do you see as kind of major things that the states are lacking in terms of ecosystem-based fisheries management?
So the question I just had was, what's the US lacking on? You're certainly not lacking on policy and process, having sat through a council meeting. What I would say, so you collect a heap more data than we do. So what I would say as an outside observer, and that's always a dangerous position to be in because I don't know any of the context of how you got to where you are. A lot of that outside advice is still aimed at just tweaking a single species system, that there's not that, well, at least in the West Coast stuff and the Alaskan stuff I've seen, there's not an intentional ecosystem structure direction being thought about. It's just, it was a high productivity or a low productivity year, so we'll adjust the TAC. There's not necessarily the interspecies interactions or a joint, we want to end up in this ecosystem state kind of idea. That could well be coming. It might be down the track. I'm not privy to those kind of internal details, but for me, coming from the outside, that would be the bit that seems to, in many ways, you're like far ahead of other countries, but you still have a very single species approach to how you're doing the management.
So following up on that, coming through the department and learning single species techniques, what kinds of courses should a school like this offer to help train like the next wave of generation of students that are going to go out and do this kind of science?
So the question was, given that the centre has a fairly single species orientation, what kind of courses could they give to expand that view? So I'd say some systems thinking, even just a systems thinking 101. So it doesn't necessarily require a huge change in the methods you use, like the minimum realistic mice method of EVA is still classically applied on a 1 to 5 species or 1 to 12 species level. It uses all the same methods that you'll learn from Andre. In fact, Andre taught the mice class in Australia 3 or 4 years ago, lying flat on his back because he'd put his back out instead of just calling the class off, I will point out. So it uses exactly the same methods. It's about thinking a little bit broader about what you bring in. So to do that broader thinking in the first place, it involves you having that systems context. So some people are natural systems thinkers and will always think a bit broader and say, no, I can't include that, but at least I'm aware that that might be an influence. But most people aren't. Most people think out the other way. They get very detail oriented and have to be pushed out. So having a class just to help you to think about what is that onion effect? If this is the core effect, what are the second and third order things that might be influencing it? So is it an environment driver I need to think about? What are the species interactions? But also going broader. So it's probably a bit different in the US. I understand you have to do a lot broader set of classes as an undergrad in the US, but in Australia you specialise from day one. Like I only ever did maths and science, ecology in my undergrad. I didn't have to do literature or English or any of that. So I learnt my economics, my psychology, my neuroscience afterwards out of interest as I tried to tackle things in the model. So having that broader exposure to different fields from the first place to appreciate the value from those. So working with social scientists, for instance, has been a bit of a challenge initially for us because when you first interact, if you come from a very statistical background, it's like, what do you mean a sample size of 4 is enough? But you can actually see that in some cases it is enough. If you're getting exactly the same answers after just 4 people, I intentionally made them go out to 20 and they didn't get any new answers. They call it, saturation. Once they get to a saturation point in answers from a certain class of people, they don't actually need to go further. So it's understanding the kind of information you're after. What are the indicators that you have sufficient information? And then the different languages that you can be speaking. So a lot of the pictures drawn here were from my husband, who's a graphic designer. And the very first day on his latest job, he rocks up and said, oh, I did box modelling all day. What he meant was he took square boxes and he drew them, extruded them, he calls it, into making it a fish shape. And I was like, well, that's good, darling, because I did box modelling all day too. And I meant something completely different. You get a lot of that when the different sciences interact. So having that broader exposure also helps in being able to listen to the different languages that you're actually going to get so that you can have. It's called the cupcake model by Alida Bundy. So when you want to have interactions with another scientist, you don't do all your work and then just say hello to the scientist on the end and they're the cherry on top. Social scientists in particular really, really hate that, funnily enough. You want it to be a tiramisu where it's all mixed in together right from the start. So that's trying to get those connections across. So start with systems modelling and then see how many other disciplines you can interact with. And we work a lot with artists now too, getting an artist in. So if you think about the future, the UN ran this process actually back in the 90s. So one of my hobbies is I'm quite a science fiction fan. And so when we're looking at the future's projections, I went back and intentionally read some science fiction stories so Heinlein wrote one for the UN, Asimov wrote one, all these big names, and I went and read them. And so what's been interesting is if you go back and see who got the answer right, the scientists, the economists, it was the science fiction authors, because they've got their consistent internal thought about how the world works. A lot of them were hard scientists first. So they've got some consistency there, but they're not being constrained by what looks reasonable today. They can use their imagination. And so that's why it can help to get the artists in, particularly if you have to go along really out of your comfort zone into a new objective or a new way of looking at the world. We also work a lot with Indigenous elders. So in Australia, at least, they think in deep time. So they'll have stories and their welcome to country can actually take hours because they're telling you their traditional stories. But if you listen, what they're actually telling you is where the species used to be, what environment it used to be. So they think in geological time and they talk in geological time, which means in today's Australian society, they usually get walloped. There's very few of them left, but if you can take the time, there's a huge richness there and they really want to engage. And looking at we did a test when we were trying to figure out who could understand a plot and who couldn't, and cumulative impacts. And out of the 500-600 Australians that we got, we presented them with a flow diagram, we presented them with a time series plot and said, tell me when the most people on the beach will be on this time series plot, and tell me how you get from phytoplankton to tuna on this flow diagram. So there were 4 scientists, 1 manager, and 1 illiterate Indigenous elder who could give me the right answer out of all of those people. So it's a different way of thinking, but it can often get onto, they naturally think in system space. So try and access that broader set of information. Yep, cool. Al?
So in the vein of science fiction, would you anticipate in a few decades there being substantial numbers of completely autonomous fishing vessels, and what
Oh yeah,
might that
definitely.
mean for management?
So Al's question was, do I anticipate completely autonomous fishing vessels? Yes, I do, because we have completely autonomous mining in Australia already. So I really don't see the difference. So we have huge mining trucks that go out to huge mining cranes that have dug up the soil. There's no humans on site whatsoever, and their safety records have amazingly gone through. They're perfect now. There's no humans killed on a regular basis. So I really do see that, particularly on the high seas, that autonomous, in fact, autonomous shipping, autonomous fishing vessels. So you can imagine that that will present its own new management challenges. In some ways, it might be easier with data collection. In other ways, the part that we lose at the present moment, and why I still argue people have to go to Mars instead of just robots, is that, you know, it took them, what, 2.5 years to retrain the robot to go 10 more meters to pick up that rock, whereas a human could have gone, I'm going to go pick up the rock. So there's always going to be that extra kind of information that you miss by not having a human intellect there, at least until we get the singularity that they talk about. But the basic AI, it might be easy to control if you have rigid rules, like the sail drones that have to follow those paths. But I'm sure there'll be new challenges. I don't think it'll solve all of our problems, but it'll probably just present new ones. But I think it will be a serious part. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the major way that industrial fisheries operate.
So you talked a little bit about the ranking of management on the scale, like what's good, and ecosystem management, when it's good, is the best. How do you quantify that risk, including ecosystem-based management, when knowing how badly it could be if you get it wrong? Does that make sense?
So because I'm God inside Atlantis, I could just do whatever I wanted in those systems. So they're all model-based worlds. So the question was, how do we know? So we had the paper result where ecosystem-based management came out ahead of single species management, but how do you quantify the risk of putting it in place if you can't do it well, it doesn't perform very well? So we could control the level of compliance, the level of enforcement, but there's pretty good indices of corruption indices generally. So there's another paper there's a few papers that have come out recently showing how the corruption index in the general population equates to your ability to enforce resource management rules, or the different kinds of rule using. So you could have a pretty good index already of what's going to work and what's not going to work in a particular set of circumstances. But in most places where you couldn't do enforceable ecosystem-based management, you're not doing enforceable single species management either. So pretty much anywhere that could successfully implement single species management can do decent ecosystem-based management as well.
So on a similar topic, actually, what have you seen are some of the most common misunderstanding or misconceptions, in the sense that the management portion thinks that they're doing okay, and then it's really not as good as they thought it was. So what are some of those misleading information or perceptions?
So Yvonne asked if there's any examples where management thinks they're doing okay when they're not, and what are those kind of misconceptions? And that gets down, the examples I can think of were where they had a very single species based view, and like a limited view into the world, and they weren't appreciating the bigger connections and interactions. So one example I can think of where they missed a range shift and a productivity shift in a lobster species because they were just looking at an aggregate value. So they were looking at the aggregate value of Purulus for the entire coast and missed the fact that it was sequentially disappearing down the coast till the last station went as well. So they had such a fine view that they weren't taking any of the other. So for years they thought they were doing the best of anywhere in Australia, and then actually they weren't. They'd lost a lot of the internal. So another classic example is less so from fisheries management, but actually a long conversation with the ENGOs where they look at the number of seabirds being caught in fishing vessels. And it's the same with dead wallabies on the road in Australia. So the idea is the less that you see, that's the better answer. You're being more sustainable if you're not catching as many seabirds. So if you blindly assume that a reduction in the number of seabirds means that you're doing better performance, you've discounted the option where you're actually just killing off all of the seabirds and there's less to catch. So it's about how you interpret the information that you have and being sure that the information stream that you're getting is actually telling you what you think it is.
Wow, that's interesting given how we count seabirds in the US. Food for thought. Folks, if you could ask, folks over.
Is there anybody online that has a question? Is there a chat thing? Where did I put my chat room?
I have a chat.
Oh, you got the one?
But, and there are 13 folks.
But no questions?
Hello.
They all went for coffee about 20 minutes ago. So there's a couple more questions in the room.
All right, let's go, yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask, what are some of the non-biological performance metrics that are used in that EBFM context, especially like with the MSc paper that you guys did last year?
So some of the non-biological ones, so the question was what non-biological parameters or indicators are used in the EBFM context, particularly say in that paper that we talked about. So some of it was just really simple things like costs, costs of going fishing, what's the breakdown, value, so what's the economic value of the catch you're getting back, how many jobs are there. But there's actually been, it's a really qualitative index, but it's called the SOPI, the sense of place index. So how happy are you to be in a fishing community and a part of that community, and how do you respond? And it's actually, while it's only qualitative, it does give you general ups and downs, like it's a qualitative relative measure, and it's working pretty well with how happy people are about fishing and their social perception.
Do they have similar things where they want like this probability that this indicator in that index is met? So like similar, like a 40% of virgin biomass probability that you won't exceed or equal to that?
So they do, we weren't using it in that sense, we were just tracking ups and downs and whether it had got above sort of threshold targeted levels that people were after. In the legislation, it doesn't require, the only probability we have in our legislation is we have to have a less than 10% chance of any species dropping below B20 in the next 10 years. All the rest of it is just about, so that's the level that we apply to that. But you could actually apply a probability to it in the same way you do any other indicator. And EVA's actually built it into mice-like models too, to look at the feedback between fishing and tourism on a local community. Yep.
So you mentioned that in some ways the pendulum has sort of swung more toward modeling away from observation and data collection. And I'm curious, when you're talking about the risk assessment, are there certain types of data that you think would be useful to have to improve that process? And also, how do you deal with varying levels of data for different species? Because you mentioned if there's no data, then it's automatically high risk. But then there's sort of like the different stages where it seems like data can be incorporated. But if you have like a little bit of data, how is that dealt with in the risk assessment framework?
So the question was, what kind of data do we think we need for the ecological risk assessment? Where are the biggest holes? And then how do we bring in the different kinds of data? So the place where we fall down the most is just basic biology. Like, are they still, where do they live? What do they eat? How much do they reproduce? How fast do they reproduce? Some of those things you can measure once and you know forever. But there was a pretty big effort in Australia to have Australian fish base. So even animals that had been well measured elsewhere were showing different characteristics in Australia. There's also been a bunch of studies looking at localised adaptive capacity. So realising how much heterogeneity happens within a population as well, and what are the implications for risk in different locations. So once you're starting to appreciate those levels of uncertainty, then you realise that we're just way, way short on basic biology for most species. So it's hard, it's not sexy, it's hard to get the top rated Nature paper on the, the life history of copepod X. But every time we go out on a survey sampling scheme in Australia, we'll bring in 99% of species will be brand new to science. So we still don't know jack shit about most of Australia. We know it's very diverse, but, we were modelling, we had to do some statistical analysis on sponge patterns recently. We're up to sponge species 358 on the northwest shelf of Australia. So there's just this huge list, and we don't have any taxonomists left either. They're all ageing out of population, and it's also not sexy to be a taxonomist, so they're not getting any new ones. So that's a huge problem. How do we bring it into the different steps? So qualitative models have been a huge benefit in that you just have to, you can have hypotheses even. So because, I don't know if you've ever done a qualitative model, it's sign diagram. So you have the thing you're interested in and the thing it's interacting with, right? You have an arrow if it's a positive effect and a dot if it's a negative effect. So if you know that there's just a connection, it's literally a 5-minute exercise to see if you get a different answer, if it's a positive interaction or a negative interaction. But if you do know for sure what it is, you can bring together any kind of data. So we regularly have social data, economic data, ecology data, even religious opinions and stuff brought in. And you can play it out live. So you sit there and you say, how does this system work? What's connected to what? And then it's matrix algebra that was invented back in the 60s with the permanent of the matrix instead of the adjunct. And you can then say, okay, these are the connections. If I press on this part, it comes back and tells you, well, these ones will go up and these ones will go down. So you can already start to bring in some of that information. And then it's also fairly robust in that susceptibility productivity plot to just knowing gross life history characteristics, slow growing sponge in solidified sediments or versus a fast growing thing on a rock. And then the topology networks, that's good to an order of magnitude. So, all the AIs that run Google and stuff, they don't want to be counting down to find details like the 4th decimal point. So they make sure they work as long as you're in the right order of magnitude. So that's also making life, it can be a bit confronting to some of my stock assessment friends who are obsessed with the 5th decimal place. But when you can show them, it's like, look, we're actually getting the same answer with just order of magnitude. That's way cheaper to get. And we're actually just as uncertain as you guys are. That's been a different change. And also for them to appreciate sometimes bringing in some of the extra information frees up parameters for them. So allowing for time varying natural mortality and stuff instead of having recruit devs define everything. They've realised that that's actually, that climate is part of their problem. That then if they explicitly bring it in, it frees up a whole bunch of other things. Before we go to Trevor, is there any questions online at all?
Not yet, actually.
Okay.
If you want to repeat, any requests, because I don't know,
They've probably all gone to lunch. Maybe they can't actually hear me. Okay, Trevor.
I'm distracted is that Australia may be more nimble than the US is in that there's a fewer number of people working on these kinds of issues. And so if you're the manager of 10 people and you decide, oh, we want to change this thing and go with quantum dots or whatever, you only have to shift 10 people in different directions.
Yes.
And maybe there are fewer layers going between the sort of top CSIRO person and whoever makes the decision with government and funding. Whereas maybe here in the US, there are more layers and more people, so to try and shift into a new direction is harder.
So Trevor's question was whether Australia is more nimble because we've got fewer people both to move and in the decision-making hierarchy. So I'd say a yes to a bit of both of that. So it's certainly the case that there's fewer of us and we aren't constrained by a whole bunch of process of we've always done these surveys so they have to continue. It's like we can shift off to something else. It also does make it a bit dangerous in the sense it's like, oh, we're just cutting that area of funding. You guys can all go do something completely different, which we've had to go through as well. We are trying to learn. Apparently, our latest CEO, who's been in place for 5 years, is from the Silicon Valley. So he's instituted 15 new layers of middle management that we've never had before. It's been quite an experience, actually. So some of that nimbleness is disappearing. The other thing that's happened is that various governments have decided that science isn't worth funding in Australia. So a large part of the reason we work overseas. So when I started with the CSIRO, we were 100% Australian government funded. I now have to bring in 60 to 80% of the income for my group. So we work in China, we work in Chile, we work wherever. And so that's allowed us to, you have to be a bit smart about aligning something you strategically want to do with delivering to a client and calling yourself that, like Mr. Silicon Valley made us call ourselves business units instead of research groups and things like that, which is, so you have to think about how you can co-opt what you've got to deliver to the client to get back what you want to do science-wise. But it does mean that you can have the chance to chase something, like go to a tech group and say, look, I've got this idea. Can we follow through on it? Yeah.
You know, you get here, if you work for no, you're not allowed to do anything.
Well, they're encouraging, the CEO's, one of his annual performance measures now is how many spin-offs that the CSIRO creates in the entrepreneurial world. So yeah, the Atlantis spin-off is never happening. Yeah, I have been asked.
So are there any more questions in the room? No? Let's give it one more go. For the
Okay, so last chance. Is there anyone online who wants to ask a question? Otherwise, enjoy your afternoon.
Yeah. And I guess just a reminder. Thank you. That was an amazing talk. And just a reminder that we have a student get-together lunch with Beth tomorrow, but there's also an EBFM panel next February 26th is a Tuesday, and it's 3:30 to 5. You're all welcome. It'll be right here in the same room, so come and join us if you can. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.